Hello everyone, Kevin Stevenson here with PhasedLogix. You can find us at GetMeTheGeek.com. We're a managed IT services provider, and today we're going to be talking about Docker. You say, what is Docker? Well, I'm going to give you a multi-part series on Docker and how to use it in your IT infrastructure. Whether you're a DIY IT person, programmer, or DevOps or sysadmin, Docker can be helpful in your organization. Let's get started. All right, first up, let me just pull up the Docker website. Here we are, Docker. And you might be asking yourself, what is Docker and why would I want to use it? Many of you are probably familiar with virtual machines. Virtual machines are basically, you take a piece of hardware, you add a hypervisor on top of it, and that virtualizes that hardware, and then you can make virtual machines, which are basically just like physical PCs, but they're virtualized into one PC. So you can put a whole bunch of little virtual machines in one big piece, in one PC that has lesser horsepower, lesser spec. Docker is similar, but more lightweight. So virtual machines and Docker are not the same thing. You can think of like virtual machine is everything that a normal machine is. So if you make a virtual machine, you're making a virtual version of the CPU, the GPU, the RAM, the hard drive, and everything. With Docker, really what you're doing is this container. So you're just made basically kind of like a wrapper, which allows you to just take a little bit of information and run a service. So what you see for Docker or for containers are single services or maybe just a few services rolled up, and they're easier to manage. When you have a virtual machine, you still have to worry about, making sure that the operating system in that virtual machine is patched and all the security patches and everything is installed. When it comes to Docker, you pull the Docker image down, you run, say we're using MySQL or MariaDB as your machine. So you pull the Docker image down for MariaDB, you run it, and you don't have to worry about the operating system that's inside that container. You just have to worry about the main operating system. So there's a little bit of less work that you have to do to maintain it. So I've heard this term before, and I really like it. Basically, is that virtual machines are like pets, and Docker images is like cattle. So, you just replace the cattle. Set them or forget them, replace them, swap them out. The difference is virtual machines you got to care for and maintain and so on and so forth, whereas a Docker image you basically just run it and you don't need to worry about maintaining it or anything like that. That's not to say there aren't some maintenances involved with that. You may have to update your Docker image, and the beautiful thing about Docker is so what you do is most of the configuration is done via a config file, which describes the Docker image and everything. So when you set up example for like MariaDB or a database, you'll expose that database to the main operating system, so the actual data is stored on the main server, not in the Docker. And that way, when you blow away the Docker image and you make a new one, when say you update from version A to version B of MariaDB, you just get rid of the container, and then you get the new container, and you point it at the existing database, and you're up and running. This is also true when you do, like, say, a web server. So if you want an Apache web server or an Nginx, you can expose the config files, the virtual host stuff of the Apache to the main operating system, and then when you update that container to a new version or whatever, you don't lose that configuration. So that's the beautiful thing about that. So to update a container, basically all you do is you shut down the container, delete the container itself, pull the new image down, and start it back up. Use that same configuration settings that you did, so it points to like whatever persistent data you had, and you don't lose it. I know I've said a whole lot there. Don't worry, I'm going to go into more detail on all of these things and in a few minutes, or actually probably as this series progresses. This is just an introduction, and so I can tell you the basics of what Docker is. I think I kind of explained it. We'll go into more detail, and let me just show you this website. So this is the Docker's website. Now, you can install Docker on Windows, Linux, and Mac. So don't worry about whatever operating system you're running. You can install Docker on it and play with it and get up and going. And here's another thing that's beautiful. You don't even have to install Docker to get up and going. Docker website has this play with Docker thing where all you do is you sign in and you can run through these tutorials, get it started in a live environment. So you just press this button and boom, you're up and going. Now, thought I was signed in here. Let me sign in to Docker. So I'm signed in here. Maybe I can just go to the playground. Play Docker. Let's go to get started. You log in. So here we go. Now, this is a web browser that's set up to run Docker. And you can play with Docker and get going in just a matter of seconds. Do you see how fast it was to pop that up? Now you get 3 hours or 4 hours basically to run this, and it'll delete the instances. So you can go in and you can create a new instance of a Docker or whatever from there. Now, we're not really going to go into this right now, but I will show you this. And then let me also show you installation. So you can get Docker up and running, and so Docker on the desktop, Windows, Mac, Linux, right here. You just install this. So I'm going to go over each one of these. I'm going to install it on a Linux box, a Windows box, and a Mac during this tutorial series. So don't worry, whichever one you are using, well, we got you covered. So Docker Hub. What is Docker Hub? Docker Hub is a place for these images. Now, if you're looking to make a MariaDB database or a web server or something real quick, Docker Hub is a great place to go to find the images that you need so you don't have to create your own. However, one of the beautiful things is you can create your own Docker images too. So again, here's the play with Docker. Let me point over this Docker Hub. Here's Docker Hub. Now, you might be familiar with a lot of things. Postgres, MySQL, Traffic. I'm not sure how you pronounce this. Traffic, whatever. But basically, it's a proxy. Redis, Node.js, MongoDB, Nginx. If any of these things sound familiar to you, these are all common applications that you might use. So you can go to these guys, download them, run them, pop it in your Docker, and nothing flat. So that is kind of the basics of Docker. Question who should be using it? I think if you are involved in development, websites, or any kind of application, Docker is a great tool there, because what you can do is you can use the Docker to have a repeatable development environment that if you have a larger team, you can, it's reproducible. That's the beautiful thing about Docker, is it's reproducible. So imagine if you're a sysadmin and someone says, "Oh, I need a MariaDB database." You can just pull a Docker image down and pop that up in a matter of seconds and not have to worry about it. Or even SQL Server. Now, I mentioned earlier that you can install this on Windows, Mac, and Linux. Let me talk about the Windows version for just a second, because it has two different flavors. Flavor number one, let me just switch back over to me. So flavor number one is Windows running a Linux Docker containers. So, and that's the default. That's how the Docker stuff came out in the beginning, and that's the vast majority of things that you're probably going to do and see when it comes to Docker. However, Windows does have a Windows version of Dockers, so you can virtualize Windows machines. So imagine that you have a Windows service. We'll call it Microsoft SQL Server. You can run Microsoft SQL Server in a Windows Docker container, or some other Windows service that you've created in a Windows Docker. And those are Windows specific Docker containers. So Generally speaking, the Docker containers are a Linux-based kernel, and so you can run things that are Linux-based on them. But there is Windows variation, and it's a little bit different beast. I came along a little bit after that. If you have Windows 10, you can do that. I think you have to have Pro. I'm not 100% sure if they changed that. However, and that's to use the Hyper-V version of Docker. There is a Docker that you can install using VirtualBox, so that's an option too. The most common thing you're going to see is probably Linux containers and Linux Docker stuff. That's probably where the vast majority of things are being done. This has been the beginning of the Docker, and stay tuned to our next parts in this series where we're going to go through installing it in different versions and what you can use Docker for. And we're going to go over several scenarios. We're going to create some Docker containers. We're going to create persistent storages, Docker networks, and a whole plethora of things. So stay tuned for our next tutorial where we go into more detail as we go through this series. Thanks for joining me. I'm Kevin Stevenson with GetMeTheGeek.com. And subscribe if you like this. Hit the bell icon if you like notifications. I'd appreciate it. Help me out. Thanks.